So I just finished Livy's Rise of Rome, as it's translated in this Oxford World Classics edition. Urbe Condita is the Latin, one of the Latin titles, meaning from the founding of the city. It's Livy, or Titus Livius's History of the Roman Republic. This is just the first 5 books, going from the founding of the city up until 390, when the Gauls sack Rome. He wrote a lot more than that, but this is just the section that I read. So it's kind of weird reading a non-fiction history book that itself was written over 2,000 years ago. I think this was written in the 20s BC. It's a secondary source, but it's almost itself a primary source in other ways. Livy himself I quite like, because he tells the stories, but he will put his own little opinions in about the sort of veracity of some of these claims, where he'll say things like, the sources tell us this, but that kind of seems like an exaggeration to me, or this tells a nice story, but I don't think it actually happened. Sort of things like that. So he does have some sort of a historical integrity, or he wants to tell the true story. He's not just out for a good tale. So this could be a long one, but I'm going to try and go book by book through these 5 books and give a quick overview of the history they cover. So book 1 goes from 753, or a bit earlier than that, with the founding of Rome. Rome was founded in 753 BCE, and it goes up to 509. So it starts, of course, with Aeneas, this Trojan hero of the Trojan War, who, when the Greeks take over the city, flees with his father and a bunch of his pals and travels all over the Mediterranean in Virgil's Aeneid, this crazy tale, until he lands in central Italy, in the sort of Latin area where Rome is now, and meets with the people there and eventually settles and founds some different cities and whatnot. We jump ahead to some of his descendants, where we have these 2 brothers, Numitor, who always gives me Tolkien vibes, that name, and Romulus, the younger brother. Romulus wants to be king. Numitor is the king. So Romulus goes and kills all of Numitor's sons, but Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, he forces to become a Vestal Virgin so she cannot have children. And so there'll be no one to sort of inherit the throne from Numitor, and so the younger brother will get the throne. But Rhea Silvia gets pregnant. She's a Vestal Virgin. How does she get pregnant? Well, of course, a god impregnates her. Where have we seen that before? A virgin getting impregnated by a god? And she bears twins. Now, these twins, Romulus and Remus, get taken away because, of course, if Romulus finds out that Numitor has some male descendants, he's going to be quite upset. And they get sent in a basket and pushed down the Tiber River. They land at a certain spot, which will eventually become the city of Rome, and are then suckled by a she-wolf. So a female wolf comes, and you think it's going to eat the children, but no, it actually feeds them. And then they are rescued by a shepherd who has witnessed all this. And now Livy kind of says, like, were they actually suckled by a she-wolf, or was it maybe that this shepherd's wife was known as a she-wolf, or had the nickname of a she-wolf, and so that's where the story came from? The sort of things like that, where he's like, okay, this is kind of crazy. Like, I don't think this actually happened, that a wolf fed these 2 children. Anyways, these boys grow up. They eventually overthrow their grandfather's brother Romulus, and their grandfather Numitor recognizes them for who they are, as his grandchildren, descendants of Aeneas, and they decide to go off and found their own city. And they go back to where they had been found by the she-wolf and found this new city. They get into a bit of an altercation, and long story short, Remus gets killed by Romulus, and so the city becomes known as Rome, not Rheme. So Romulus becomes the first king of Rome in 753. Now, at this time, Rome's just a bunch of dudes. It's Romulus and all of his guy friends, so there's no women at all. So they decide to have these games where they invite all the neighboring peoples from all the neighboring cities to come over and have these games. They're having a good time, but Romulus and the Romans eye up all of the young unmarried girls and kidnap and rape them in this famous tale that becomes known as the Rape of the Sabines, because a lot of these women are Sabine women. Not all of them, but most of them are. The Sabines naturally retaliate and are like, why did you take all of our young girls? We want them back, and start fighting the Romans. But the girls themselves run in between the 2 sides and put a stop to it, saying like, look, if you have this battle, no matter who wins, we lose, because we're either going to become orphans if our fathers get killed, or we're going to become widows if our now husbands get killed. And so the Sabines and the Romans make a pact and decide to become one people. And in fact, one of the Sabines becomes sort of a co-king with Romulus, and there's 2 kings, although he eventually dies and Romulus remains sort of the sole ruler of this whole place. Romulus then sort of dies, but he doesn't actually die. He's sort of taken up in a whirlwind, very Enoch style, and goes to live with the gods as the deified Romulus, leaving the people to elect a new king. So the kingdom is not hereditary. Romulus does not have any children that we know of, or that I know of, and they decide to elect a Sabine as the next king, Numa Pompilius. Now, he sets up all the sort of religious institutions of the state, very into the gods and all that jazz. He dies and they elect another king, this guy Tullius Hostilius. He's all about warfare. So we had the religion guy, now we've got Tullius Hostilius. Think of the name Hostilius, hostile. He's all about warfare. And he sort of sets up Rome's status as a warrior culture and as a culture dedicated to warfare and expansion. Then he dies, and then we have king number 4, Ancus Marcius, who is sort of a mix of the two, a blend of Numa Pompilius, the religiosity, and Tullius Hostilius, the sort of warrior king. And I believe he's actually the grandson of Numa Pompilius. Next we have Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. Priscus meaning the elder. So there's going to be another Tarquinius later, but this is Tarquin the Elder. He's from Greek origin. I think his father was Greek, but his father had moved to Etruria and married an Etruscan, and they lived in this city there. They were quite wealthy, quite well-to-do, but being a sort of a foreigner, a Greek in an Etruscan society, he couldn't really sort of move up the social ladder. So he's looking at this new city, Rome, where, you know, they're fresh, they're hot, they're not as established, and so it's easy to move up the ranks there. So he moves over to Rome, starts schmoozing and politicking, and becomes king. And he has this slave, Servius Tullius, this young boy, who was born to one of his slaves. And there's something special about this boy. He sort of, his head lights on fire, but it doesn't consume him. And his wife sees it and is like, hey, this boy's special. We should pay attention to this boy. And then Livy sort of hints that maybe he wasn't actually a slave. He was a slave because he's born from his mother, who was captured, and his mother was actually royalty from this other city. So this Servius Tullius guy, he's a slave, but according to Livy, maybe not quite a slave. But back to Tarquin the Elder. So Ancus Marcius' sons, so the previous king's sons, are kind of jealous of this Tarquin guy. They're like, we want to be king. Our dad was king. Why can't we be king? So they get this proxy to go and kill Tarquin the Elder with an axe. And they stab him with an axe, runs away, and Tarquin's wife, Tanaquil, is very smart about this. She announces that, oh, he's not dead. He's just, it was a glancing blow, flesh wound, he's recovering, he's a bit dizzy, don't worry about it, we're sorting it out, we're gonna find out who did this. When Ancus Marcius' children, the ones who had tempted this coup, find out, they flee into exile. Meanwhile, Servius Tullius, the slave, former slave of Tarquin the Elder, has sort of become his heir. And with the help of Tanaquil, his adoptive mother, he starts to consolidate power and marries Tarquin's daughter, and then finally announces, actually, sorry guys, Tarquin the Elder, he's now dead. I guess I'll be in charge now. Think Servius like servant. He's the guy that had been a slave. He's now the king, and he's doing a great job. He's a really good king. But there is the fact that he's the first one to not be elected by the Roman people. He sort of stepped into the role, almost in a hereditary way. We then get another conspiracy with the two sons of Tarquin the Elder and the two daughters of Servius Tullius. And this is where it gets confusing, because to me it's these two daughters. The Servius Tullius married Tarquin's daughter, so these two daughters who then marry the sons of Tarquin are like marrying their uncles. Anyway, we got these two brothers marrying these two sisters, but the matchups are really bad. We get the sort of the hot-tempered one marrying the mild-tempered one, and then the mild-tempered one marrying the other hot-tempered one. And so they eventually kill their spouses, and then the two remaining ones get together and start plotting how are we going to overthrow Servius Tullius, who is the father of the girl, Tullia, and the boy is Tarquin the Younger, Tarquin Superbus, which means the proud, he becomes to be called. So he marches into Servius Tullius's palace or whatever and says like, hey, you were a slave, you were never even elected, you're not a true king, get out of here, and gets him killed and takes over. And so now we have Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Younger, as this new king. And if that's not bad enough, Tullia, Servius Tullius's daughter, runs over his corpse as she's going back home and like splatters his blood all over herself, and yeah, she's really evil. So this Tarquin the Younger, he rules like a total tyrant. He is an awful king. People are not doing well under him. But he is quite tricksy. He gets one of his sons to seemingly defect to the nearby town of Veii, and this son says like, hey, my father's a tyrant, like let me in, help me out. And his son sort of works his way up through the ranks of the Veii and then sends a message to his father being like, all right, I'm embedded, what do you want me to do? And there's this sort of famous scene where the messenger relays this to his father, Tarquin the Younger, and Tarquin the Younger is walking through a garden and there's these lilies, and he sort of uses his cane to swipe and cut the very highest lilies down, but doesn't respond to the messenger. So the messenger gets sort of fed up, runs back to the son in Veii and says like, hey, your father was just doing this thing with the flowers. I don't know, like he never told me anything. And the son's like, I know what he means. He wants me to kill the leading members of the Veii aristocracy, which this son manages to do because he's ingratiated himself with the Veii. They think that he's on their side, and so he institutes these pogroms and these culls and manages to take down the leading figures of Gabii society, and Gabii eventually gets annexed by Rome. They're then besieging this other nearby town, and a bunch of the boys, a bunch of Tarquins' children, they're quite bored, they don't know what to do with themselves, and they're like, hey, let's talk about our wives. Who's got the best wife? And they're arguing and they're drinking, and they're like, hey, let's just go back to Rome. It's night, nothing's happening here, and we'll check in on all of our wives and see who's the best wife. And so they do that, and most of the wives are just sort of partying and having a good time, but then they come across Colantinus's wife. So Colantinus, he's Tarquinius Colantinus. He's like a cousin of the other Tarquins. He's not the son of the king, but he's related to the family. His wife, Lucretia, is the only one that's like doing work and is like being a very, trad wife lifestyle, spinning wool and whatnot, and worrying about how her husband's doing. And he walks in, reveals himself, and they, hug. And one of the other guys, this Tarquinius Sextus, son of the king, son of Tarquin the younger, he gets really jealous and sees this beautiful woman, and he's like, I want her. And so the next night he comes back to her house, stays at her house, and then forces himself on her, and at sword point forces her to give in to him. And he says to her, if you do not allow me, I will kill a slave and put the slave's body on you and claim that you had fornicated with the slave. And so she relents and he rapes her. The next day she's super disheveled. She calls her father Lucretius and her husband Collatinus, and they're like, what's wrong? You are so distraught. Like, please just tell us. And she eventually gets out like, hey, she was raped by the son of the king. And they're all really upset. And they sort of tell her like it could have gone two ways, especially in a very patriarchal society where women have no rights. They could have sort of blamed the victim, right? And said like, oh, you're unclean now. We got to get rid of you. But in sort of a, I don't want to say a very woke way, but at least in a very healthy way, they say that sin comes from the mind, not the body. So because your body was defiled, you are not guilty. Like, you did not want this, obviously. And so you are the victim of this rape, not one of the perpetrators of it, which to a modern audience seems obvious, but I think kind of stands out in 6th century BCE Rome. And she says something like, well, you can forgive me, but I can never forgive myself for something, and stabs herself and dies. And one of the other men there, this guy Brutus, now Brutus is an interesting character. He's been faking being kind of dumb and just to sort of survive in the tyranny of Tarquin the Younger. He doesn't want to seem like a threat, so he's been acting just like a goofball sort of thing. There's this one scene where they're at this oracle who says that the next person to kiss their mother will be the victor. And so the Tarquins, the sons of the king, are rushed back home to try and kiss their mom, whereas Brutus is like, I'm smart, I'm thinking. He pretends to trip, and falling down, he kisses the earth, Mother Earth, and that's sort of hinting that he is going to be victorious. What is he going to be victorious in? Well, at the death of Lucretia, he tears the dagger out of her body, and with it still dripping blood, he holds it up and swears an oath to banish the monarchy and the Tarquins from Rome, which is what he does. He marches into the city, he gives this great speech, which really shocks everyone because they didn't think that he was sort of had this genius. Where has this Brutus been all our lives? And manages to chase the Tarquins, the whole family, flees Rome, and thus Brutus has sort of saved the now republic. Rome has gone from a monarchy to now a republic, and they elect 2 consuls to run the city. Consuls have a 1-year term, and there's also this right of appeal where if you don't really agree with what the consul's doing, you can appeal to the people, and sort of it's the beginning of the republic, right? And that is the end of the first book. Yeah, we've got 4 more to go. Book 2 goes from about 509 to 467 and starts with the Tarquins, who have found refuge in another city, trying to get that king to attack Rome so they can get their kingdom back. So the Tarquins are in Clusium, which is a town with, or a city, where this guy Lars Porsena is the king. And he agrees, hey, sure, I'll help you get your throne back, one monarch to another, and besieges Rome. And we get these great stories. So we have this story of Gaius Mucius Scaevola, who he's a young guy, and he wants to kill Lars Porsena. He's like, if I can assassinate the king and sort of cut off the head of the stake, I can free Rome. But he goes to the Senate first. He's like, hey, do I have permission to sneak out of the city and try and kill this guy? And they're like, yeah, sure, go for it. So he does so. He sneaks into the camp, but he doesn't know what Lars Porsena looks like. And he sees these 2 guys, really fancy, talking to soldiers, doing kingly duties and whatnot. And he stabs and kills one of them, but he killed the wrong guy. He kills the king's secretary by accident. So he's captured, taken before the king, and in a very Roman style, Mucius is like, look, I'm the first of many. There is 1,000 Roman youths lining up to try and assassinate you. I was just the first. There's going to be another one, and then another one, and we're just going to keep going until we kill you. And Lars Porsena, he's like shocked at this. He's outraged. He's like, well, tell me everything. Tell me who these people are. What's the plan? He's like, if you don't, I'm going to throw you in the fire. And Mucius is like, you think I care? He takes his hand, sticks it in the fire, and lets it burn. And like, I can just imagine like keeping eye contact with Porsena the whole time. Doesn't even flinch as his hand is burning. He's like, my body means nothing to me. I'm a Roman. Like, there's nothing you can do to hurt me. And Lars Porsena is so impressed with this. He's like, okay, you know what? I don't want to mess with the Romans anymore. Let's make a peace deal. And so they make a deal where the Romans give some hostages, some of the younger Roman aristocratic children, to Porsena, but they agree they're not going to let the Tarquins back into the city. That was Rome's number one. They're like, that's never going to happen. And Porsena, he's like, okay, fine. Look, the Tarquin guy, he's just hanging out with me. I don't really care. Whatever. Give me the hostages and we'll go. And he starts leaving, but one of the hostages, this Cloelia, this young girl, manages to get a whole bunch of these other girls and leads them out, and they escape, swim across the Tiber, and get back to Rome. And Porsena's outraged at this, like, hey, I was supposed to get hostages. If you don't send, like, I don't care about any of them. I want the ringleader. I want the Cloetia. I want her back. Give me her back. And if you do, then I will let her go free. But you need to trust me. And if there's no trust, then we're not going to have a peace deal. And Cloetia is like, sure, I'll go back on my own. I'm an audacious Roman woman. Like, it doesn't matter to me. And she goes back to him, back into slavery, essentially. And Porsena is, again, really impressed with this. And so he's like, all right, Cloetia, you can go back, and you can even take some of these other hostages back with you. You can pick a few. And so she picks the really youngest boys, which I can imagine her as like a, I don't know, 14-year-old girl, and you get these like 4 and 5-year-old boys who are like miss their parents, and she's like, all right, fine, takes them back. There's another story, I skipped it, but it's a classic about this Horatius Cocles, who, when Porsena is attacking, this Horatius Cocles manages to hold this bridge across the Tiber single-handedly. Everyone's fleeing across the bridge. He stops, puts his spear down, and is like, no, I'm going to stand my ground, and fights off a whole bunch of people on his own, which is a classic story. We see that all throughout history. And then when they finally manage to cut the bridge down, the Romans do, to prevent Porsena from advancing, he throws himself in full armor into the river and cries out, like, as this is a sacrifice to Tiberinus, the god of the river. But then Livy says that he manages to swim his way back to Rome, and he's fine, which Livy says in true Livy style, a bit of daring that posterity was to find more praiseworthy than credible. I love that about Livy. So Rome keeps fighting with its neighbors. This is sort of an ongoing thing where during war season, campaign season in the spring or summer or whenever, Rome is always sending people out on raids to plunder other villages and towns. And the nearby towns are sending people out to raid and pillage the Roman countryside. And then they're having these sort of low-level wars perpetually. It's no great wars of conquest. They're not taking over towns and cities. Well, they might be taking some sort of villages and land is exchanged. But for the most part, it's just moving plunder back and forth between these various peoples. Whenever Rome's in really dire straits, they have this office of the dictator that they elect. They'll choose one man, and that man will be in total charge of the city for a 6-month period. So he's only for 6 months. He can resign earlier, but everyone has to listen to him. There's no appeals. You do what the dictator says, and he will get you through the hard times. And it's really cool that it has that 6-year limit, so it won't revert to a monarchy. At this time, also, we have the sort of stratification of Roman society into the patricians, the sort of the well-to-do, the aristocrats, and the plebeians, the everybody else class. It's like an upper and a lower class, but we still have the slaves and the servants who would be like the lower class. So the plebs are kind of in the middle, but I wouldn't say they're a middle class, but you can kind of visualize it that way. They're not lower class. They're just not the super wealthy, rich aristocrats from whom the Senate and the consuls are chosen, the patricians. And whenever Rome is not fighting an external enemy, it is this internal struggle between the plebeians and the patricians that is just ongoing for centuries. And this comes to a head at the end of book 2, where the plebs are just like, you know what, we're done. Like, we are so in debt to the patricians. The debtors have been chaining us up, selling us into slavery. There's the story of this one guy who was a soldier, and he had to pay his taxes, but he couldn't pay his taxes because he was fighting for the city. So then he had to sell his land, and then he had to sell his father's land, and then he had to borrow money so that he could pay the taxes, and then to pay the loan back with interest, he had to sell more land, and eventually was himself sold into slavery, and doing this all while fighting for the Republic. And a bunch of stories like that led to this secession of the plebs, where the plebs all get together and we're like, you know what, we're done. We're just leaving the city. We're not dealing with the patricians, the Senate anymore. You guys don't care. there. You're using us like slaves. It's basically, we've traded the monarch for a double monarchy of these two consuls. We're done. And some of the patricians are sent out to negotiate with the plebs, and they eventually agree to come back into the city under the provision that they create this new magistracy, the tribune of the plebs, who are these people, originally 2, and then it goes to 5, and then a bit later there's 10 of them. These people that will represent the plebeians, and they have quite a bit of power. So the tribunes of the plebs are to the plebs kind of like the consuls are to the patricians, or also the whole city. All right, book 3. We're going from 467 to around 446. Again, more like petty wars with the nearby people. Whenever they're not doing that, they're doing lots of infighting between patricians and plebeians. The tribunes of the plebs are blocking a lot of things. Like whenever the patricians want to go to war, the tribunes of the plebs are like, no, we're not letting you enroll any of our plebeians in your battles until you sort of give us something in return. And then the tribunes of the plebs get attacked for like, hey, you know, Rome's enemies are at the gates and you won't let us raise an army. You're as bad as our enemy, blah, blah, blah. Back and forth. The way Livy, I don't know that Livy's really one-sided or the other, but I guess he would be, I don't know if he's a patrician, but I imagine Livy is sort of writing to a patrician audience with his history. And reading it, I sort of felt like I was on the side of the patricians, which is crazy giving my beliefs. But yeah, a lot of the times the tribune of the plebs felt like sort of union leaders that are blocking the government from progressing and stuff like that. Anyway, so Rome wants a written legal code. They don't have anything written down, and what they do is they send 3 guys off to Athens, which is kind of cool because this is like sort of the height of Athens, and they're like, hey, look into the Solon's law, come back to us, we'll figure something out, we'll write down this law code. So while those guys are off getting this law code whole thing started, there's this little story about the Quinctiuses. You have this guy Caiso who gets accused of murder, but the way Livy sort of says it is that he didn't actually commit the murder, and it was really just the plebs trying to get at these patricians. Caiso, the Quinctiuses, they're patrician as they come, right? And this guy Caiso is being held. He's indicted on a murder charge, and this is the first introduction of bail. They say like, hey, if you can pay this exorbitant amount of money, you're free to go for now, but you got to come back when the trial happens, or you owe us all this money. And you can sort of see the writing on the wall that he's not going to get a fair trial, and so he just flees and exiles himself. And then when the trial comes around, they're like, hey, he's not here. His father, Lucius Quinctius Cincinatus, or Cinncinnatus, from which the famous city Cincinnati is that a famous city? Is named after him. He has to pay this exorbitant fee, and so he has to sell all of his land, becomes destitute, even though he's still patrician, and goes and settles this small farm on the other side of the Tiber. Now that's important for what's coming next. So later on, during one of Rome's wars, one of the consular armies is surrounded and is about to be wiped out. Rome's in dire straits, and the Senate is looking for a dictator, and they're like, who do we have that can save us from this predicament? And so they go across the Tiber to the farm, and they find, wearing his work clothes, plowing his field, Cincinatus. And they say to him like, hey, put on a toga, you are a dictator, go save the Republic. And it feels very much like a sort of, I don't know, a Marvel movie or something. Like, I guess what is that movie? Rogue One, when it's a Star Wars movie, when the Imperial guy says to the farmer, he's like, a man of your talents farming, it's a peaceful life. It's very much that, where they go to him and he's farming and they're like, we need you back. And so he puts on his toga, he becomes dictator, and he leads an army and defeats the enemies, saves the consuls, saves the Republic. And so the dictator resigns after 16 days in office. He could have been dictator for 6 months, that was his term, but it only took him 16 days to save the Republic. And sort of becomes lauded as the Cincinatus, as the savior of the Republic. Although, to me, there's a man much later, we'll get to at the end of this book 5, that to me is more of a savior of the Republic. But anyways, Cincinatus, much later, when he's in his 80s, he's called up again as a dictator because there's this conspiracy going on where one of these plebeian guys is getting really rich, there's a famine, and he's managing to give grain out to a lot of people and becoming very popular, and he sort of has monarchical ideas. He wants to become king of Rome. So they call up Cincinatus. He sends his lieutenant out to call one of the conspirators in, to question him, and the conspirator runs, and the lieutenant cuts him down and kills him. And he's like, that's proof of his guilt. You know, he didn't obey the dictator's rule, and so it's not really murder because whatever. And Cincinatus is like, good job, Lieutenant, we solved the case, and, and then resigns again. So back to the law code. In order to write these laws, they need to have some magistrates with the power to create laws, sort of almost dictatorial monarchical power. So they create the Decemvirate, which literally means 10 men, this body of 10 men that are going to write the laws, and they have all the power of a consul, plus there's no appealing to them, so you can't appeal, which you can with a consul. You can say like, hey, I want to appeal to the people, I don't think you're being fair. So these people are almost like 10 kings, 10 tyrants. To cut a long story short, the guys from Athens come back, the Decemvirates sit down, and they create these 10 tablets with the written codified Roman law. But then they kind of like the power they have, and so they don't leave. And we have this one guy, Appius Claudius, who becomes sort of the head, the ringleader of these 10 men that are total tyrants and are ruling Rome like 10 petty kings. And things come to a head when Appius wants this girl, which I know it's like Lucretia all over again. We have this girl, her name is Verginia, of course it is, Verginia, and she's quite young. She is engaged to another man, and her father and both her fiancé are out at war, and so Appius, back in Rome, manages to grab her on her way to school and puts her on trial. And she's not a slave or a servant, she's a plebeian, but she's a Roman citizen. But he claims that she's actually a slave because she had been born to one of his slaves, and that makes her a slave. And that her father, Verginius, had actually taken her as a baby and claimed her as his daughter. But it's not actually his daughter, she's actually his slave. And there's no evidence for this. Appius is basically taking a free Roman citizen, turning them into a slave, a sex slave essentially, for himself. And the people are in an uproar about this, naturally. And they manage to get word to both the fiancé and to her father. And Appius sends messages like to the army saying, keep Verginius back, don't send him. But there's some bad timing, and Verginius gets back to the city. And again, a big hullabaloo, and Appius says like, hey, until we sort this out, she's going to stay with me because she's actually still my slave. So until you can prove she's your daughter, she's going to stay with me. And Verginius, her father, is having none of this. So he grabs Verginia and he stabs and kills her. And he's like, I love my daughter. I'm not going to have her be pimped out by you. Like, she's going to die a free Roman citizen rather than be a sex slave to your disgusting desires. And the whole city rises up, the plebeians, I should say, and causes the second secession of the plebs. They rally to Verginius and flee the Decemvirate and Appius. And this resolves itself by the Senate sort of stepping in and electing 2 consuls, scrapping the Decemvirate, and reinstating the tribunes of the plebs. And it's these 2 guys, Horatius and Valerius, who are the 2 sort of patricians that are sort of on the side of the plebs and help resolve this issue. All right, book 4. Book 4 will be much shorter, I promise. We're going from about 40 years, from 445 to about 404. So again, more fighting between plebs and patricians. Then there'll be some enemy at the gates, and then they'll focus on the external enemy. Once the pieces are solved, they go back to internal fighting. The big change here is the plebs are really fighting for the right to be consuls. So consuls can only be from the patrician class. And plebs are like, what the heck? We are just as involved in the state and have just as much at stake as the patricians. Let us be consuls. And the Senate, the patricians are having none of this. They finally agree to a compromise that some years, instead of electing 2 consuls, they'll elect these things that, in this translation, it's translated as the military tribunes with consular power, which is a bit of a mouthful. Sort of consular tribunes. And it starts out, there's 3 of them, some years 4 of them, and in other years it goes up to like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, even 8 of them at a time, depending on how many sort of generals the state needs to fight all of its various wars. And so some years they'll elect consuls when the patricians sort of have the upper hand, and then when the plebs are really rowdy or really fighting for it, other years they'll elect, instead of consuls, these military tribunes with consular power. This book ends with the Senate passing a law to have the state pay soldiers to fight battle. So before, fighting in an army was just sort of your civic duty. Plebs just had to do it. But now the patricians are like, look, we'll pay you to do it. And the plebs never asked for this. The tribune of the plebs weren't fighting for this. And so the plebs are overjoyed. They're like, we love the patricians. You guys really are like our fathers. This is great. But the tribune of the plebs are kind of like, well, cool, but where's this money going to come from? Like, the state's going to pay them. Well, who's the state? Well, we are the state. So you're just going to tax us more and then use that money to pay us. Like, which I fully agreed with. Like, it feels like a a politician being like, we're going to give you free X. Wow, free X. Yeah, but actually you have to pay for it. Like, I wanted to make the comparison with universal healthcare where like, oh, it's great, universal healthcare, but you have to pay for it. But I don't think that's a good comparison because I really think universal healthcare is a no-brainer, much better idea than private. But anyways, the army's now being paid, but the state has to raise taxes. The plebs have to pay taxes to pay the soldiers. And so it really hurts sort of veteran soldiers who have done their military service as young people, and now that they're older and don't have to fight, they now have to pay so that other people can fight. So they're sort of paying twice, as it were. All right, final book. Book 5, we're going from about 403 to 390 BCE. So Rome is sieging the nearby city of Veii. They've been sieging it for 10 years, very Trojan of them, and there's sort of finally an end in sight. But the plebs are quite upset. Usually they go out during the campaign season, they fight their wars, then they come home, they sow their crops, harvest their crops, whatever, and then go back and fight again when the time has come. But now that they're being paid, Rome has been perpetually at war and through the winter, which is why they've been able to besiege Veii, this great big city. I think it's even bigger than Rome at this time because of these new sort of political, social, military innovations. But the plebs are suffering from it. So to finish off this siege that's been going on for 10 years, we have this dictator Marcus Furius Camillus, who, to me, he's the sort of the real savior of the Republic. Sorry, Cinncinnatus. He constructs this long tunnel underneath the walls of Veii, and they manage to break in and they take the whole city. They sell the whole population into slavery. They loot absolutely everything, and it's fantastic. And if that wasn't enough for Camillus, they go to another city, much smaller one, maybe a town, and they're besieging it. And one of the citizens of that town, this school teacher who has a bunch of his class, who are all sort of the young children of the heads of state and the aristocrats and the bigwigs from this city. And he takes them all out to the Roman camp and says, like, here's all these children. You can use them to negotiate. And he's sort of betraying his city to the Romans. And Camillus is like, I'm a Roman. We do not win by treachery. We win by strength of arms. Take yourself back to your city. Take all these children with you. We will fight you fair and square. And that guy doesn't get treated very well when he gets back to town. But then the town sues for peace. And again, Camillus is victorious. But there's this petty issue with loot and how Camillus was dividing up the loot, or he sort of swore some of the loot to the gods, and how it's not fair to the plebs, and why did the plebs only get this land and not that land. Eventually Camillus gets exiled by the plebs. They political infighting, they force him to unfairly go into exile. Poor guy, after all he's done for the Republic. Plebs then start arguing like, hey, we should just move to Veii. It's this great city, it's totally empty, it's got much better infrastructure than Rome, it's bigger, the walls are great, why don't we move to Veii? And the patricians are like, no way, we're Roman, our gods are here, we're staying here. Then we sort of enter the climax of this story, where so far we've seen Rome fighting with the Etruscans and the Latins and the sort of nearby towns and cities, very local places. And we suddenly have entering on the scene the Gauls. Now the Gauls are a Celtic people from modern day sort of northern Italy. They've crossed over the Alps to northern Italy, but they're from like France and places like that, more northern and western. And the Gauls just sort of suddenly appear on the scene. And if you know it's coming, you know it's coming. So a nearby town is being attacked by the Gauls and sends to Rome for help. So Rome sends 3 ambassadors, the Fabii, these sort of aristocratic sons, up to negotiate with the Gauls. And negotiations fall apart, and the ambassadors, who should just be hands off, get involved in the fight. And actually 3 Romans fight against the Gauls, and one of the Gallic chieftains is actually killed, which is a major no-no. So the 3 Romans head back to Rome. The Gauls are hot in pursuit and are like, hey, give us those 3 people. They broke sort of the laws. They were supposed to be ambassadors. They're supposed to not be neutral, not be involved, but they fought and killed some of us. And Rome's like, actually, no, we're gonna keep our dudes, sorry. So the Gauls declare war on Rome. And Rome doesn't really take this seriously. Rome has had so many victories and sort of dealt with everyone that Rome doesn't even appoint a dictator. They don't even try and summon a big army. They sort of cobble an army together, head outside of the walls, and before they know it, the Gauls are there. The Gauls have moved so fast, and Rome's kind of shocked by this. And then we have the battle at the Alia, which is a disaster for the Romans. The Romans get totally stomped. The Gauls just wipe the floor with them. And the Romans are so terrified, they just flee. Most of the army goes to Veii, which again had been empty, and so the army's now hiding in Veii. The citizenry just start fleeing Rome. A lot of them start packing up the gods, all the priestly caste and whatnot are traveling to different towns, and everyone's taking everything they can and getting the heck out of Rome. They've even left the gates wide open, and the Gauls are standing there like, why are the gates open? They're sort of expecting it. This is a trap. This is way too easy. So the Gauls are sort of holding back for a bit. Meanwhile, like I said, people are just getting out of Rome. There is sort of a core of the Senate, the very young members of the Senate, those who can fight, fortify the capital and sort of the very, very heart of Rome and stay there to defend it. But for the most part, everyone is leaving. The very old senators and sort of ex-consuls and ex-dictators, and they sort of dress up in all of their finery with all their medals and like their Sunday best, right? And they sit down in the middle of their sort of palaces and mansions and whatnot, and just sit there like sort of very statuesque. I love this scene in Livy. And so the Gauls sort of slowly start to creep into Rome, and they're looking around like, where's the trap? All the plebs have locked their doors, those that have stayed behind, but all the patricians have their doors wide open, and like I said, are just sitting there like statues, these old men with flowing gray beards, and it's really creepy, right? The Gauls are looking in and seeing these people all dressed up, looking just like almost godlike. And finally, one of them's like poking one of these senators, who then like whacks him on the head with a stick, which causes the Gaul to then stab and kill him. And then all sort of heck breaks loose, and Rome starts being sacked and burned. Again, they're still holding out on the capital, though. A select few of the very young in the Senate is up on the capital. The army, meanwhile, in Veii, sort of gets themselves together and is like, all right, the only reason we lost is because we didn't have any good commanders. We need a good commander. Who do we have that could lead us to victory, to storm Rome, defeat the Gauls, and take back the city and save the capital? And the answer is obvious. Of course, it's Camillus. But Camillus is exiled. He's in a nearby town. And they could just go over there and be like, Camillus, we need your help. But no. They need to do this properly. They need the Senate to recall him, to get rid of his exile and banishment, and they need the Senate to appoint him as dictator. And so they get this one messenger to sort of float down the Tiber, sneak into the city of Rome that's besieged by the Gauls, and scales the cliffs of the capital, goes into the Senate and says, hey, we need Camillus. Can you recall him and appoint him dictator? And the Senate, of course, is like, yes, we'll do it. He's back. He is now the dictator. Camillus is running everything. The guy then sneaks down the cliff and heads back to Veii and alerts the army that then go pulling Camillus out of retirement/exile for one last job, which is like my favorite trope ever. Meanwhile, the Gauls and the Romans on the capital are still kind of fighting. At one point, one of the Fabii, I think it is, actually descends from the capital with like a whole bunch of ritual sacrificial kit and goes to perform one of the sacrifices that his family has been doing for X number of years. And the Gauls are all like accosting him, yelling at him, what is this one man doing? What, like, we're going to kill this guy. What does he think? Like, what's he up to? And then they see him performing this sort of sacrament, and they are kind of blown away at the audacity to sort of walk out amongst an enemy to do this, but also the piety of him. And they respect the gods as well, and so they sort of let him go back up to the capital after he's completed the sacrifice. And the Gauls have sort of seen messengers crawling up and down these cliffs, trying to sneak in and out of the capital, sending messages back and forth. And so they've decided, hey, we're going to sneak up those cliff sides at night, and we'll get into the capital, and we'll slaughter everyone. So the Gauls start doing this, but the geese sacred to Juno that are on the capital, by the way, the capital, they're starving, right? They're being besieged. They're starving, but they haven't killed Juno's geese because they're holy to the god. And the geese start honking and alert the sentries that there are people climbing up over the cliff. A bit of a fight ensues where the Gauls get repelled, and so the sacred geese manage to save Rome. Like I said, the Romans are starving. The Gauls are calling out to them, hey, like, sue for peace. You guys are gonna starve to death. So the Romans start throwing bread down on the Gauls, which they are starving, but I love that they're throwing bread down like, oh yeah, we got all kinds of food. We can just throw it away. But eventually they do break down, and the Gauls themselves aren't doing great. It's a super hot summer. There's pestilence and disease. They haven't been able to bury their dead, and so a lot of the Gallic armies quite weary. They're a long way from home. And the Romans finally agree, hey, look, we'll sue for peace. What do you want? And the Gauls are like, you give us 1,000 pounds of gold. We'll take the gold and leave, and then you can keep your stupid city. And so the Romans come down from the capital. They start piling up all the gold they can onto these balances. And one of the Romans notices that the scales are unfair. They're being cheated. The scales don't work, and says so. And the Gallic chieftain Brennus tosses his sword onto the scale so that the Romans will then have to pay more gold, and says, "Vae victus." which is Latin. I don't know how the Gauls speak Latin, but maybe they do. Latin for woe to the vanquished, which is just a phenomenal line. Like, oh, you think we're cheating you? Well, you lost. Too bad. So as they're sorting out this gold thing, Camillus and the army finally arrive. And the Gauls are like, hey, look, we made a deal with the Senate. We're getting the gold. You can't fight us now. And Camillus is like, hey, I was appointed dictator by the Senate. That means, and if it wasn't by my authority, it doesn't count. So come on out here and we'll have a fight. So of course they have a fight, and naturally the Romans and Camillus win and defeat all the Gauls and save the Republic. So Rome's been burned, pillaged, it's in a rough state. And so the plebs are like, all right, obviously we're going to move to Veii now, right? It's like, Veii's untouched, great city. We're just going to travel over there. And book 5 ends with a very long speech by Camillus telling them for lots of reasons, mainly religious, why you can't abandon Rome at this time. And because of the speech, they all agree to stay and rebuild Rome. And that is the end of book 5. So that's a lot, but it's really cool. Like, it's so cool that we have sources like Livy that have been passed down for over 2,000 years. Just mind-boggling. And I know a lot of this sort of history is quite mythological, and is it true, isn't it true? I don't care. I think it's like amazing stories, like the story of Verginia, the story of Camillus, of Cinncinnatus being recalled from his sort of small farm to become dictator of the Republic. Just really, really cool stuff. So that was the first 5 books of Livy's Rise of Rome, or Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city.